The other thing that sort of turns out to be extremely powerful for Snowflake, and I think other companies will discover as they do the usage-based pricing, is that consumption-based pricing, at least the way Snowflake does it, it unbundles the sales motion from the procurement motion. And that's a very powerful thing to do.
Welcome to Unpack Pricing, the show that deconstructs the dark arts of SaaS pricing and packaging. I'm your host, Scott Woody, co-founder and CEO of Metronome. In each episode, you'll learn how the best leaders in tech are turning pricing into a key driver for revenue growth. Let's dive in. All right, Sam, thanks for joining us today. Really excited to have you here.
Excited to be here. Thank you, Scott.
Awesome. For those of you who don't know, Sam is an expert in monetization. I think most recently he spent about 4.5 years at Snowflake, and before that worked at kind of leading pricing companies in the cloud space in Microsoft and ServiceNow. So thanks for jumping on the pod with us. I want to start with a relatively easy question, which is, why is properly pricing so freaking hard?
It's hard because I think it's really three things, right? One is that it is a multidisciplinary domain and it spans really wide, also goes really deep. If you think about who is involved in pricing and what goes on there, it's really like some part product management is a large part of finance, but there's a lot of sales and marketing and really like operations involved as well to launch something in the market. You're touching a lot of different parts of the market. So the effective pricing leader and really effective anyone working in pricing, you kind of have to speak all these languages to get all these teams to work together. So it's just a really difficult sort of interdisciplinary domain to really get right? You have to kind of bring a lot of people together. You have to get them to coordinate, and then you have to really be able to speak the languages. It's also highly strategic and highly tactical at different times. So usually often at like different stages of the same project, you start out with something being very strategic, and then you might jump into a next project, next phase of the project that becomes very technical and you have to go very deep, right? So there's this constant spanning wide and going deep kind of motion going on. That makes it very difficult to do. The second part is it's both an art and science, right? There's a huge analytical component to it. There's a lot of quant research, but a lot of pricing, if you at the very high level, it's really about incentive, power structure, even down to like organizational, or if you're doing B2C, then the consumer psychology matters a big deal. And those are, lots of consumer psychology studies out there, lots of quantitative studies out there around pricing, right? So it's a very interesting field that touches both the left brain and the right brain. The last thing I'll say is like people think it's hard because it's a little scary. Pricing is one of these like what I call sledgehammers that you have is not a scalpel. It has this potential of having this really wide blast radius of effect. If you think about the really basic equation, revenue of a company equals price times quantity, then your price is literally the multiplier for the entire business, right? So as a result, every little changes can have this massive impact on so many functions, so many teams. And so people are sometimes reluctant or a little scared to make the bold changes necessary. The other part is also it raises the coordination problem because it affects everybody. Everyone wants to say in it. So navigating that decision-making process, navigating communication path becomes exponentially more challenging as, a company scales or as a company, business becomes more complex.
Cool. Okay. So there's like a ton in there that I would love to kind of peel back at least a layer or two. So I think one of the first things you said is pricing is hard in part because it's a very multidisciplinary function. So in your mind, does that lend itself more toward like a functional organization that's like really focused on pricing? Or is it more of a horizontal organization where your kind of pricing is best done as like a collection of maybe a person over here in sales, maybe here in product, maybe over in marketing, and we kind of work together as a pricing council, or is that a false dichotomy? Like what's the ultimate, in your mind, org structure for actually accomplishing good pricing?
I've seen it done both ways, both well and not so well. The pricing function, I think, is a center of excellence, but like any strategic organization, I think the job is to be a horizontal function that touches everything. So I think you really do need a group of experts to coordinate the work, but the pricing team can't do everything. Like they really, as a service organization, you really are not, you have to work with the PMs to drive the business case. You have to work with finance to drive the business model, financial forecast. You have to work with sales on, making sure that the way it lands is correct. There's sales enablement aspects. how it affects compensation, how it affects sales operations. Those things all need to be worked through these teams, right? So there's a centralized sort of center of excellence component of driving these functions, but there is very much really not much needs to be a cross-functional thing. So, being a pricing kind of function person, you're a large part, you're a coordinator and a project manager, but you're also, setting the tone and driving the narrative for the company.
Great. I'm curious, whenever I see these kinds of large, really cross-functional kind of projects, I'm always curious, how much do they need a really strong executive driving force to kind of push it through? Is successful pricing always a top-down thing, or are there ways of having driving pricing changes that are much more bottom-up or kind of lateral kind of collections of folks? Is it always the CEO has to drive, or are there other ways of successfully driving pricing initiatives?
I think it depends on the altitude and types of pricing projects. I know that we get into a lot of it depends. But it is true. I think for a lot of pricing projects, anything that touches a price point, again, because of that blast radius issue, it really should require a pretty senior, strong senior level visibility, right? And frankly, for public companies, this pricing is considered core business control. So you have to have a strong governance policies around how to make these decisions. Something that is important. And for many types of pricing projects, it might not be a CEO, but it might be a group of executives, but you do have to have senior leadership be the decision-making body. So a lot of companies stand up what's called pricing committee. Sometimes the CEO is on it, sometimes it's not, but usually I think that's what a lot of really smart people would say, best practices that have the CEO, CFO, head of sales, head of product. Those are kind of the four leaders that really cares about pricing in different ways, right? So that's usually how it's managed. Now, there are other pricing projects, especially as a company scales, that doesn't or really isn't appropriate to go to the C-suite, right? And so as the company scales, as the function becomes more mature, you create more empowerment and layers to allow for more tactical decisions to be made at a lower level to maintain agility. And I think the evolution of how you evolve that policies and control is one of the core jobs of the pricing leader. And certainly we have done that at Snowflake in a number of places.
Very interesting. One last question on this, just because I'm so interested in how effective pricing leaders work. What do you think are the one or two kind of meta skills that you specifically needed to have in order to kind of handle the both super broad problem space, but all this is super deep art and science, analytic and incentive understandings? What are the skills that you uniquely have that make you effective in that kind of organization?
Yeah, I think one thing that I have that is somewhat unique is that I sort of have experience working in organization from product management all the way to sales. I've reported into, at this point, a product team, sales team, finance team, marketing team now, have that background and understands kind of how these leaders think and really the language they speak, right? So, and being able to do that and recognizing sort of what's important to each of these functions, I think is very important. I always sometimes joke with my friends that I'm sometimes like the translator between all these organizations. I kid you not, I've been in meetings where for 20 minutes, the engineering lead and the IT lead were using the same word but saying different things, and they weren't recognizing they're talking over each other. And sometimes I have to step in and tell them that, what do you mean by this? Do you mean that? And before they so recognize it. So I think that's a really important skills is to, be able to effectively speak the language of these different teams. I'd say the second thing is that pricing, especially at tech companies where I spent my career, you have to love the product. You have to love technology. So in a sense, it's not a function where you can get away with by being sort of the domain expertise. You really, I guess, especially because you have to work so closely with the product managers and really sometimes the engineers. You have to be pretty technically, competent or fluent in at least their languages. And so in a sense, when I'm hiring a pricing manager, I look for very much the same skill sets as product managers. I say, especially folks that are working on the inbound side of things, where they're working on the core pricing packaging of products. Their skill sets are 80% overlap kind of product people.
Oh, okay. That's kind of maybe, I don't think super intuitive to everyone. So what I'm hearing is that to be an effective pricing expert, you actually need to really understand the product itself, and I assume how it's consumed and why people are using it. Do you have a kind of a good example of how, maybe take Snowflake or one of the previous products you've priced, like how your understanding of the product actually helped you get to a better pricing outcome by having that expertise?
Yeah, I'll give an example of when we are looking at pricing for the Snowflake Copilot. The actual architecture of how Copilot works in terms of the prompt and the prompt engineering and the additional token that's being injected into the system. And there's two pass LLM. They pass through two different LLMs in order to try before the results comes out. Really understand that and understand that to a pretty sophisticated degree, both in talking with engineering and talking with product. It's really important because it impacts unit economics, understanding how many extra token you're injecting into the prompt and all the other things that really drives it. So it drives the financial model to a very sophisticated degree. And the second thing is also it drives a different use case. So you sort of have to learn to ask the right questions around how is customers going to use it? What is this going to actually do? How is this going to help the customers? Because again, like how these are being used and what the product is capable of and the features capable of drives the value proposition of the product. So in a sense, you have to be able to ask those right questions in order to sort of guide the product leader or the engineering leader to understand what they want or what they're missing from their business case in order for you to sort of propose what type of studies or analysis or modeling you need to do in order to kind of build the business case and build the right pricing.
Okay. So it's like this like deep understanding of the product that it sounds like even the technology, also definitely how the customer gets the value from it. And what I'm hearing is a little bit of a feedback loop between, okay, what does the product do? How does the customer experience it? And how are we going to price the value? So basically like kind of mapping, the price to the value, and then the product experience needs to express both obviously the value of the thing, but it needs to be coherent with whatever your pricing unit is. So you gotta make sure that the entire package is a coherent feedback cycle where it's not driving a bunch of usage that then is unmonetized or leads to a mental model mismatch between I'm not really getting very much value and you're charging me a lot of money for this thing. So I'm really curious in that world, how early in a product development cycle do you think pricing should be involved?
I'd say as early as possible. Every company I've been at, I've pushed for at least me or the pricing leaders to be part of the product ideation roadmap. So I would ideally love to have visibility a year and a half out into at least what's being thought of. And partly because I think, especially for larger companies where priorities gets booked up a year in advance, so planning in other organizations are done, on an annual basis. So it's important to have like visibility into sort of the capacity and the capabilities that of all parts of the organization, right? So, it's good to kind of have those early on and be able to identify potential proposals that could have large impacts on the business and loop in the appropriate people early. So in a sense, I think a little bit on the PM side of things, I've heard other people says that pricing manager, pricing strategy people are like product managers with like a different spin. They instead of focus on the product, they really focus on the system. Right? So the overall is that the feedback loop of monetizing that with the product or the value. So the other thing is, while product is focused on creating the product and features that delivers a value, what pricing manager does to help augment and help the product team as they create those values to bring in these outer contexts, bring in the context of the finance team, bring in the context of the overall company strategies that's outside of the scope of what the PM thinks about, and bring in sort of the context of the capacity of the IT and others, the downstream business requirements that needs to be considered. So that's really, again, same skill set, same thought process, but applied to a different way.
That makes a lot of sense. So in a way, pricing, it's very akin to the skills that are needing to be a great product manager. Have you seen examples where like the two are merged? Is it possible that you could have one person who's both a great product leader and a great pricing, or is there some like kind of necessary distance between the two to get to the right answer in your opinion?
I've seen many great pricing teams built out of the product organization. So in fact, I say since I've been leading pricing and building pricing teams, majority of my career has been spent in the product organization, right? So I've always been at Infoblox. I was on the product leadership team. the CTO, and then at ServiceNow, and a good chunk of my time there, I was in the product management organizations. So either way, you have to be pretty embedded regardless of where you sit. So that's a really critical relationship, especially given that most technology companies are product driven, and you really have to be embedded with them.
Well, one follow-up question I would have that I think is always very challenging when you're bringing a new product to market is finding the right unit of value or value measure, especially in a usage-based business. And so, I think it's all well and good when you're kind of entering an established product space and it's like the kind of de facto way of thinking about value has already been established. But I would love to hear how you would advise someone who's kind of maybe doing something that's like net new in the industry, how to start to make headroads into a good value measure for their pricing if they want to price to value.
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say is the value metrics, or the metrics that you, especially in regards to usage-based pricing, there are really two, I guess, top level requirements or criteria. One is that it should align with kind of how the customer's perceived value, right? So ideally, you want to make sure the scaling of it is something that customer understands and that customers sort of almost intuitively recognize that, yeah, like it makes sense for me to pay more based on this, right? So if you can't clear that bar, then you're in trouble. The second thing is ideally it's something that scales with your costs as well. Now this is a little tricky because sometimes those two things could be orthogonal, but ideally you don't want to be priced on a metrics that doesn't scale with your costs, right? And it's sort of one of the reason why, a lot of these SaaS companies today that are on pure usage subscription-based pricing are struggling or really are really thinking hard about their pricing model, because AI, that potential to lower the number of users, right? And also the cost of AI is really scaling based on tokens for all the B2B companies who are doing API calls to OpenAI. The tokens is this proxy of usage for compute on GPUs. It scales orthogonally from users, right? It could be one user using a lot or many users using very little. It's a very different way of scaling costs. So it's something that you really ideally want both of these things to occur in the pricing metrics.
Cool. Yeah. So taking the first one, finding a value metric that makes sense or resonates with the end user. Do you have any kind of tips or like in the early days, how to explore, Snowflake has a very specific way of talking about value. I'm curious how that was discovered. Was that something that kind of came to market and we're going to just sell it this way and this is the right way? Or was there like a market discovery process? And when you're thinking about launching a new product or launching a new kind of, usage-based product, how do you go through that discovery exploration process? Is it like user interviews? Is it like a top-down taste? What have you seen work when trying to like pioneer a new usage or unit of value?
Talking to customers is good, right? So early adopters is really important. In the case of Snowflake, it's really interesting because I don't think Snowflake was consumption from day one. There was not even a discussion. This was a core philosophy that Benoit and Terry, the founders, had, right? They set out to build a cloud native data platform. And if you look at if you're going to design a database or a data warehouse that runs in the cloud, you look at the pricing model of these cloud providers and they're all on consumption based, right? So again, like the hyperscalers have been on consumption since day one. So I don't think there were many discussion or any at all from the early days where they're going to go consumption. So Bob Mugley, the CEO before Frank, he was kind of a big believer in the cloud as well. I see even since his days at Microsoft. And I think he recognized very early, if they can mirror the economic advantage that these hyperscalers have around, the pay as you go, really pay for only what you use, that can be both a very powerful message and a really powerful economic driver and competitive advantage for the company. Right? So it really, I think, sets the tone from the beginning. And it's something that I think Snowflake really bet the farm on early on. When I joined Snowflake, there was no debate about, whether there should be consumption or not. But by then it was very much 100% consumption driven. And it turned out to be the right bet. It became very successful.
Yeah, I feel like a large part of if you read like analyst literature and you kind of just study the physics of that business, it's like a consumption-based model is like one of the huge reasons to say, yeah, this has like been a successful business. And it sounds like they kind of lived at a philosophical level in the early days. I'm curious if there were any edges to that philosophy that kind of made certain things hard. Because whenever you have a philosophy, there's like benefits, right? It simplifies a lot of things, but then it also closes off like possibility space in others. I'm curious if you ever kind of ran up against an edge of the philosophy where it actually got really hard to do certain types of things because of this pure usage philosophy.
Yeah, it is not easy, right? So paying for what you use is a very powerful message. So I'll go over the advantages first and then go over some of the disadvantage. It helps lower, I think something we learn over time as a company was that it's really advantageous because it lowers the barrier to entry and kind of so removes that doubt about value delivery, right? So for example, with ServiceNow, there's always talk and worries about, hey, are we over subscribing? Are we over licensing users? Is there a lot of shelfware? And so even back in Microsoft, when we're selling licenses, there's always talk of like these vaporware, shelfware, these phantom licenses customers bought and never really utilizes that are really missed. With consumption pricing model, you don't have to worry about that. There's no question on that. You only pay for what you use. So that's a very powerful message that allows you to kind of grow efficiently, grow leanly. Like your revenue is high quality. There's not a lot of kind of extra slack. The other thing that sort of turns out to be extremely powerful for Snowflake, and I think other companies will discover as they do the usage-based pricing, is that consumption-based pricing, at least the way Snowflake does it, it unbundles the sales motion from the procurement motion. And that's a very powerful thing to do. So, for example, with Snowflake, for a lot of the enterprise customers, once the contract is signed, any incremental new features, a product can launch all these new features without launching new SKUs, right? So you just put in the consumption table, you update it, done, right? The minute you GA, customers can start using it and then start paying for it or start consuming it immediately. So the sales motion becomes this continuous cycle, right? So the sales team isn't aligned to, driving it's not necessarily just looking to sign a new contract, or if customers want to use the new features, they don't have to wait to go through a procurement process, buy a new SKUs. They can just start doing that. And so, job of sales when you're selling, you're really looking for new workload and driving new workload into the platform. And that can happen anytime throughout the year. So I think it's vastly sort of simplified the procurement motion and also accelerates the time to value and also time to revenue for new features, new products. Now, other disadvantages, of course, it's a lot harder to forecast.
We just talked about all of the nice advantages of having a usage-based model internally. What are some of the challenges that come with being a pure usage business, especially at a scale of a company like Snowflake?
Yeah, there are challenges in the sense that I think it's harder to operate. It's inherently harder to track and harder to predict. And from a revenue forecasting perspective, consumption-based pricing is very challenging, right? At Snowflake, it took a long time. And frankly, a lot of sophisticated data science and modeling to really get to the point where you can forecast be a public company. It is also harder for the complexity of the workflow to make sure you are metering and billing and rating the customers correctly is also very critical. So there's inherently sort of a larger kind of overhead to making sure you do that. So that's a challenge that a lot of companies don't know how to meet. They don't know how to organize the work to make sure you do that effectively. And, and everything has to work, right? If one thing breaks the entire getting revenue from customers. So it's pretty critical. It's also, I don't know if there's an advantage or disadvantage, but, it shortens the product feedback loop in the sense that if something is not right or you ship the bad product, you will know right away. Customers just not going to use it. So in a sense, it's really scary because you're really constantly exposing yourself to customer churn all the time. You're not locking any customer in. But at the same time, I think if you're able to live with that or acclimate to that, then I think over time, it helps the company build better products.
There's actually, you said two things there that I think are super interesting and kind of at least unintuitive even to me, which is the first you said was in a pure consumption business, it makes it easier to continuously insert value into your product suite. And this is hits home for me because before this, I worked at Dropbox, and every time we launched a new feature, it was always well, should we give it to the free tier? Should we give it to the paid tier? Should we give it to the team tier? Which of those should we do? And it was always a really complex calculus. And what it meant was that it was actually quite hard to go launch new features and get feedback. And so if something was speculative, you really had to be thoughtful about how is this going to change our upgrade cycle? And what I heard is that in a usage model, it's actually the incentives are aligned. If it's useful, people will use it and they will then therefore pay more for it. And it can kind of like lower the friction to deployment. So I would love to kind of hear a little bit about how in practice that you think that changed the product development process or the launch process at Snowflake. Did you have big bang releases, or was it more of a continuous process? And like, how did you think about like incremental value being stuffed into the product?
Yeah, all three at the same time at Snowflake. So I'd say for the most part, values are being injected into the features and packages continuously, both in terms of, just frankly, something as simple as making efficiency gain in how the software, right? Where you're passing on a lot of those efficiency gain savings to customers, thereby for the same amount of Snowflake credits or they consume, they can run more queries. New features we have the same debate, right? So when product launch and new features, Snowflake do have sort of good, better, best editions, the standard, enterprise, and business critical. And there are constant debate of which edition do we put it into? But the interesting thing is, even though we're debating which features it goes into, we never have to worry about customers not paying for it, because if those new features drive incremental use of compute, they are paying for it, right? Because those additional CPU cycle times gets accrued and they pay at the rate that, those that they're metered on. So that becomes a very advantageous and very powerful message. At the same time, there are brand new kind of large big bang releases, right? Where Snowflake goes into a new workload where we're driving for example, launching capabilities on a whole set of new compute primitives.
How do you think about what changes about operationalizing a pricing change in a usage model? So like what I'm thinking about is, how does a usage model change the incentive behavior for what an AE should do or an AM should do? Theoretically, it should. And so I'm curious what the maybe unintuitive parts of being an AE at a Snowflake or a pure consumption business are that might differ from maybe a traditional kind of subscription or license-based business.
Yeah, sales incentive and sales planning becomes different. And it's something that I think Snowflake evolved quite a bit over the years. The revenue in a usage-based company, especially a pure usage-based company like Snowflake, is tied to consumption, right? So really, when customer pays you, especially if they're paying the contract up front, like most of Snowflake customers, dollar collections or signing the contracts around and gaining bookings or RPO, this has nothing to do with revenue. So in a sense, incentivizing the rep to sign a large contract or get a large commitment from customers isn't necessarily a good thing, right? Especially if there's no plan behind how customers are actually going to consume. The real metric is around consumption and how to drive consumption. Over time, Snowflake has certainly evolved the sales compensation model to more align to the consumption. It took a while to get there. It also becomes somewhat unintuitive in the sense that you almost have to treat what Snowflake called greenfield versus kind of brownfield type customers differently, right? So established customers where you have already sold into the account and you're just looking to expand out of it. That's really about driving incremental consumption, incremental workload, and consumption is a really great unit of measure for evaluating the sales productivity and rewarding sales productivity.
So maybe talk a little bit about kind of the difference between you have large accounts and driving incremental workloads versus net new logos, maybe smaller logos. Were those separate reps? Did a given rep both, hunt and farm, and it was just like a mix of their time? Did you actually find a specialization in reps, or how did Snowflake approach those kind of two very different ways of growing a book of business?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That has evolved over time. So I think early on, Snowflake have really compensate rep on what we call net new ACVs, net new growth on the contract. And then over time, we found that that's less effective because, again, revenue is really tied to consumption. So you really want, especially the more mature reps and more mature accounts, to be focusing on growing kind of consumption because that's what's tied to. But for smaller companies, especially for reps that are focused on territories that are more new logo rich, that's where we still sort of have elements of compensating them to sign new ACV and logos and that get net new bookings. Because again, compensation for a lot of these smaller accounts may not materialize right away, especially for net logos. It takes what we found is that it takes usually 6 to 9 months for consumption to really ramp up.
Do you know if reps basically stayed attached to deals after because again, it's like, in the beginning, they might start the beautiful thing of consumption that they start and they have no spend. And then maybe they have a commitment. And then if the customer commits and then just never uses the product, then there's no value created. And probably that customer is going to churn at some point. Were reps kind of incentivized to stay attached and help make sure that initial commit actually translated in to usage, or do they hand it off and it shifted to more of a traditional account management model?
So one quirky thing about Snowflake, and this is a Frank Slootman thing, is that we have no customer success team at Snowflake. Frank has is very adamant about this idea that it's everyone's responsibility for customer success. And that sort of makes sense and sort of double down, so to speak, in consumption or usage-based pricing, right? Because you don't recognize or you have no revenue and this customer actually uses it. So the sales cycle doesn't stop. You're both trying to expand and drive new workload, but also at the same time, you're like making sure like all the reps and all the SCs are on a plan that's tied to consumption. You're also incentivizing them to make sure that they are consuming to plan, so to speak. So really driving that alignment has been very critical for Snowflake's kind of growth and success over the years. Now, there are skill set differences, and what Snowflake has also discovered that hunters don't like to farm and farmers don't like to hunt. So there are specialization and issues that we're discovering over time that needs to be fixed. So there is a recognition that there may be AEs that are more focused on kind of the customer success motion versus AEs that are out there trying to acquire new business with Snowflake. But I certainly are seeing inkling that we might create pseudo customer success team within the sales organization circle.
Well, I do think that kind of like everyone's in customer support does align to the usage-based philosophy in a way that you said. So I think that's a nice coherent worldview. I'm curious. I noticed you wrote some blog posts on usage pricing. And one of the things that I saw in there was kind of this framework around how to price in terms of resources, utilization, activity, outcomes. I'd be curious if you could just kind of explain the high level framework. And then I'd love to dive into a couple of details of the different ways of doing usage-based pricing for companies.
Sure. I think it's really an exploration of and helping people recognize that, not all usage metrics are the same. And broadly speaking, right, when you talk about usage or consumption, it can really be measured based on some input and output. So you can be metering customers or you can pricing metrics that are tied to more input oriented activities, or you can tie to more output or out-oriented activity. And we then kind of expand that and say, hey, like maybe there are maybe 4 general categories of potential usage metrics out there. One, say, most tied to consumption or resources is really, pricing to resources, pricing to the activity and pricing to activities, where you're pricing to the, like AWS, you're pricing to the number of seconds that you're using on the VMs or a number of terabytes consumed. That's kind of pricing the resources, right? And then pricing to activities is this idea of some kind of usage or proxy of consumption of resources, right? So Snowflake, for example, if you're talking about Snowflake credits, that's pricing to activities. It's a proxy for a Snowflake credit is really a proxy of the resources used, and it serves as a measurement of compute utilization and activities that's on there. Tokens is another, if you look at AI, like tokens is another activity-based metrics in terms of it's really it's about 4 characters, right, on the prompt and in and out. So those are the activities. And then when it goes to kind of pricing to output, you see a lot of startups in the AI space. Synthesia is one, where they're pricing to the number of minutes of videos being generated, right? So this now you're shifting to more sort of value-centric type pricing instead of more cost-centric pricing, where pricing to the output of the applications or the services. And then if you're really kind of on the far end, where from a pricing practitioner perspective, where you can be most aligned to the value would be trying to price it out. You're paying for the outcome that you desire. The most prominent example out there is today's Intercom's Fin, where it's like a customer service agent. They price based on the number of resolves the customer service call, right? So that's a very powerful way of kind of really aligning outcomes to value and aligning that monetization. But that has challenges because it's oftentimes really hard there's an attribution problem of, are you sure this is you can attribute the value solely to the application or to the value that this AI provides or this software provides. So, oftentimes that's difficult. So then that's kind of the high level spectrum. Just a survey of, getting folks to think about, hey, there are these spectrums of usage metrics, and really finding the right one is something that you should be thinking about closely as you go and try to build a product and figure out how to price it.
Yeah. The thing I hear a lot when talking to folks in Silicon Valley is the outcome-based pricing. But when I look, I actually think the examples of successfully doing this are very rare. And so one problem you mentioned is the attribution problem. It's like, really, did this software do this, or did the human using it do it? How do you think about that? Do you think that's like a education and kind of bake time thing? As AI percolates and sits for years and years, we're going to all agree that this is the outcomes? Or is the outcomes more of it specifically works in very specific instances, but mostly like you should be thinking about input, output, or activity based metrics? Should companies try to get to outcomes? Is that like ideal, or is it more of like a, only in certain circumstances type of business model?
I think only in certain circumstances. I think we're going to find spectrums of AI. I think I know, especially in the investor class and, among the VCs, everyone's really excited about the agentic stuff that's coming out. I know a lot of companies are saying we have AI agents, but they're not quite there. But it's certainly coming where you have these more sophisticated AI systems that can sort of work on complex workflow and complete complex workflow. And for those type of AI that's working to automate or working on really complex tasks that involve multiple steps and involve making decisions, etc. I think there's more possibility of using a outcome success based type pricing model. But at the same time, if you look at let's just pick any large workflow company like Salesforce or ServiceNow, they're going to have AI eventually everywhere, right? There might be some type of AI agents that they'll be offering, but their core businesses and their core products and suites of services also will have a lot of AIs there that are really not designed to automate, but really designed to assist human. And in those cases where they're completing a task of generating content, or they're summarizing tickets, or what ServiceNow is doing, the outcome pricing is nonsensical, because really it's about tracking human productivity, right? So I think I think all of these pricing models will have its place based on how AI and these large language models are going to be used in the product. Going to be used to assist the human or help human do better? Are they there to generate content, or are they there to automate workflow? I think each of these can call it modality of engagement of how they engage humans and how they deliver value for companies and customers will, I think, drive a lot of these pricing models out there.
That makes a lot of sense. It's ultimately, you have to really understand how the customer is going to value the product and make sure you find the model that is best aligning price to value. But I think the other aspect of AI, at least right now, that's super interesting to me is that it's also really expensive typically. And like the costs are definitely input based and output based. And so like what's your advice for companies that are kind of thinking about adding AI into a product line? Maybe let's say they have a seat model and they're adding in AI to do some Gen AI stuff. How do you think about pricing in a world where the underlying resource utilization is extremely expensive in a way that's like pretty different than honestly most technology?
It's an area and it's a topic being vigorously debated in the market right now. Certainly, I think a lot of companies have come to the conclusion that we need to start thinking about a usage-based model or some kind of hybrid model where you have usage limits or usage caps or some kind of usage metrics that scales with kind of some of these AI usage. Because to your point, a lot of the cost of these AI scales different user. And then there is also this risk of the automation and AI really over time creating a situation where, there's just going to be less user required to be using these software. So that's one of the kind of like main implications of the cost side of the equation for AI. The other interesting thing I think will happen is that it's also making software easier to write and faster to write. So with Copilot and other things, you're going to just solve like a feature is over time, I think, has the potential to be more commoditized. So in a world where you are becoming more commoditized in your base features, think about what that means for a company like a Workday or ServiceNow. Other companies or competitors who want to copy your features are going to be able to do it faster, easier, cheaper. So you do have to find new ways to create new packages that create value differentiations. And you're going to have to stick to, say, the better, best package. Features may not, like your traditional software features or use cases may not be the right kind of ways to create these value differentiations for it to drive higher balance, higher monetization. It's what is going to take its place. So AI might be a place where there can be different value differentiations that can be created based on these service offering. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and these AI, and then, it becomes this positive feedback loop that goes on. So you need more AI to drive more feature differentiations in your offering. That also puts additional pressure on the usage pricing model. And because AI services scales differently with usage, right? So I think it'll be a very interesting transition for a lot of these companies to figure out how do they, in the short term, retrofit their pricing model into AI in mind, the AI services in mind. And then over time, as I think AI services becomes more important and part of the value chain that they do, or the value that they deliver, then, how does that impact the business model over time?
So a lot of people are paying attention to this stuff. They're a pricing expert. They're sitting inside a company that has a pretty big business, a couple $100 million in AR, let's say, and it's a subscription or a seat-based model. And let's say that person's looking to explore or maybe potentially transition to usage pricing. What would your advice be for that pricing expert to even just start the conversation? What are the analyses or the things that they should be doing on day zero to prepare for the potential move to a usage-based model?
I think first thing is to really understand the AI roadmap. We alluded to this earlier, where there can be different ways of AI is being used, right? So really understand what is the use case, what is the value that these new AI systems that these systems want to incorporate into your product, what's it going to deliver, and really understand that roadmap. And understand the cost element of these roadmap, because making an API call to OpenAI is relatively cheap on a per unit basis. But if you're doing fine tuning, you're doing RAG, you're doing all these more context specific use cases, then all of a sudden these costs can be exponentially more expensive. So really understand both, and then ask the question, or really force the conversation around, is this a net margin accretive strategy or a margin dilutive strategy, right? So really understand, is this something that's going to help make the company more profitable, less profitable, and what's the revenue potential there? And that should be the starting point of how every company evaluate AI. And, at least that's certainly one element, right? So there are other issues that should be brought in around competitive dynamics and the market pressure of kind of doing these things. So those are all important, but certainly really understand how AI alters the unit economics of your business and the revenue potential and the willingness to pay. Really pay attention to that. And this is a rapidly evolving space. So I think companies are really still discovering like product market fit and really product market pricing fit of AI, and how to use it in a way that drives the most value for the company and for customers. So something that I think is a conversation that's going to be repeated over and over again at many companies.
Are there skill sets or types of people that theoretical subscription organization might not have, and that in order to execute what you're saying might need to go talent that they might need to bring in? Or do you think it's like, the traditional kind of strategic finance or pricing function can be adopted to the usage-based modality? One thing I heard very strongly is, in a usage-based context, you really have to understand the unit economics in order to price properly. In a seat model, of course, you need to understand it at some like gross high level, but in a usage-based context, it's really one of the dominant factors and something you have to be like very front and center. Are there other pieces of information or kind of philosophical or operational things that that you might want to bring into your organization as part of thinking about usage pricing?
Yeah, I think the general strategy and frameworks used to price other products applies to AI generally the same way. So my comment is really more about usage-based pricing in general, like regardless if AI is part of the picture or not. I think it's really important for pricing managers and pricing leaders to have a deep appreciation of the operational mechanics of usage-based pricing. it's more important than ever where you can't recognize revenue unless you understand how it's being metered, how telemetries are emitted, how things are being metered and rated, and how that connects to the downstream system. It's something that is, again, like if one thing breaks, everything breaks in that workflow. So I'd say, in the world of usage-based pricing, I think pricing leaders it's a focus area that cannot be neglected. Product managers typically don't have a good sense or have large expertise on a lot of downstream systems and how they affect kind of monetization. So it's up to kind of the pricing leads or really people who are doing this job, regardless of what you call them, to help complement the product leaders to help them understand whose job it is to emit telemetries for rating these products and drive the usage statements for the customers. And how does this all connect down to the downstream systems and around revenue recognitions, around collections, around invoicing, right? So understanding that workflow very clearly, I think it's key to success, right, in terms of execution.
Awesome. So it sounds like if you're thinking about a usage-based model, data fidelity, data workflows, data integrity become like critical things that need to be threaded through the entire stack from where the telemetry originates all the way through down to how the revenue gets recognized. And you need to make sure that that data is there and tracked the entire time. That's like I strongly agree. I've seen many companies that have not, had to solve that problem. And as soon as you move to usage, it becomes like a problem that you straight up cannot operate the business unless you fix it. So I strongly agree with that. Well, this has been great. I would love to close on one question. You're obviously sitting at the forefront of a bunch of big trends, AI, usage pricing. What's one unique idea or one idea that you want to put out into the world that you wish more people would spend more time thinking about that you think is key to the future of pricing in Silicon Valley?
Yeah. And it's still very speculative, but one of the implications of AI, and Sam Altman and others have said this, right? Like large language models at the end of the day kind of like compressed data, right? Like this is data highly compressed into a model to run inference. And because AI at the end of the day is just data, one of the implications that AI can potentially alter the commercial relationship between software vendors and their customers, right? So in a sense that the value exchange becomes not one way anymore. Customers now have these data that frankly, the company wants to and need to kind of train and build and really continue to evolve their AI services. So it becomes this more bilateral motion of value exchange, not just you're a software vendor, you deliver value to customers pays you money. Now there's this other component of, yes, you're doing that, but at the same time, customer also has some data and some asset that you want. And frankly, as these AI models evolve and these AI services evolve, probably you're required in order to create differentiations, because if everyone is on ChatGPT and running kind of the pre-trained model, then there's no differentiation in the AI services, right? So to create these enduring differentiation, you really need more kind of private, so these usage data that are more tied directly to your company's specific context or the specific use cases. So what does that mean? I think that means from a pricing strategy perspective, pricing leaders will start and you have to start thinking about not just acquiring revenue, but also acquiring data. So data acquisition needs to be part of kind of the equations and think about the value exchange of the companies. And so how does dynamics impact pricing? And, especially these more sophisticated AI systems are more context driven. How are they going to be used? Are they going to be used specifically for the customer itself? Or are they going to be allowed to use outside of that to train and fine tune for the broader model? That will be really fascinating to watch in terms of where things are. I certainly think because there is this new element of customer having something that companies want, I think that alters the commercial relationship.
Very interesting. And I look forward to this new, weird, interesting future where companies are both, they're paying us for our data and, we're paying them for their services. That's like a super fascinating model.
Exactly. So you can almost imagine a world where you might pay one price if you want your data to be private, or you allow your data to be used in some way to train a model, then maybe you pay a different price. Who knows where this will go, right? This is me thinking ahead.
Very, very cool. I think this is what I love about this space is that the kind of commercial product functionality, AI, it's all combined in this weird, nice kind of stew. And I think the only thing I can predict is that the world's going to look really weird, really fast. And I'm very excited about it. So Sam, thank you so much for your time. Maybe before we go, where can folks find you? What's the best way to kind of learn more about what you're up to?
For the most part, I'm on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is probably the best way to reach me. I am on Twitter, but it's mostly a private, personal account. Yeah, LinkedIn is probably the best way.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. This was a fun conversation, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of Unpack Pricing. If you enjoyed it, we really appreciate you sharing it with a friend. We'd also love to hear from you. Feel free to email me at scott@metronome.com with feedback and suggestions for who you'd like to see on a future podcast.